It's 7 in the morning, and you're standing in the kitchen deciding whether to eat anything at all. You read somewhere that skipping breakfast gives your blood sugar a break, so some mornings you just have black coffee and wait for lunch. Other mornings you eat because skipping feels wrong, and then you wonder if you just undid the whole plan. Neither morning feels like a decision. It feels like a guess, repeated every day, with nothing to check it against. By the end of this video, you'll know what the actual research on meal patterns after 60 shows, why the answer isn't a simple skip it or don't, and the one thing about your first meal of the day that matters more than what time it happens. Here's where that advice comes from. Somewhere along the way, skip breakfast turned into a kind of folk metabolism theory. Not eating means no sugar coming in, and no sugar coming in must mean your blood sugar gets to rest, like giving a tired muscle a day off. It sounds tidy, but it isn't how insulin resistance actually works. Insulin resistance is really about how efficiently your body clears the sugar that arrives, meal after meal, week after week, over months and years. A single skipped meal doesn't rest that system, it just delays the next test of it. That question matters more after 60 because insulin sensitivity tends to decline with age on its own, even before diet enters the picture. Muscle, which is where a lot of that sugar normally gets absorbed, naturally shrinks a little with age too, so there's less capacity to clear the same glucose load you handled easily decades ago. Sleep changes, some medications, and less daily movement can all add their own small effect on top of that. So the same eating pattern that worked fine at 40 can behave differently now, and a piece of advice built for a 30-year-old trying to lose weight may simply not fit your body at this stage. Now, let's remove some noise before we go further, because most of what circulates about this topic is louder than it needs to be. You do not need to pick a permanent side in the fasting debate today. You do not need a 16-hour eating window, a fasting app, or a strict rule you'll break by Thursday. You also do not need to force down a big breakfast you don't want, just because someone told you to. This video is not going to tell you fasting is dangerous, and it is not going to tell you fasting is the secret fix. Both of those claims go further than the evidence does. Simple sells. It just isn't accurate here. What you do need is to see what the research actually measured, because it is more specific and more useful than skip it or don't. The meal frequency study people are quoting. A 2025 study in the Diabetes and Metabolism Journal followed more than 4,000 adults in their 40s, 50s, and 60s for close to 10 years. Researchers checked in on how many meals people ate each day, then tracked who went on to develop insulin resistance and who did not. People eating 3 or more meals a day had about a 12% lower chance of developing insulin resistance than people eating fewer than 3. That is the number behind the eat more often advice you may have seen. It is real. It is also smaller and narrower than the headline makes it sound. Here's a plausible reason it showed up at all. When you compress your eating into 1 or 2 large meals, each one asks your body to process a bigger glucose load in a shorter window, like pushing rush hour traffic through a single lane instead of spreading it across 3. Spread that same food across 3 steadier meals, and no single meal has to do as much work at once. Less peak demand, on paper, is gentler on a system that's already slowing down with age. Picture 2 people eating the exact same groceries across a week. One eats it in 3 moderate sittings a day. The other eats the same total food, but compresses it into 1 large dinner most nights, because lunch got skipped and breakfast never happened. Same food, same total calories, different shape. It's that shape, not the food itself, that the study is picking up on. But that's not all worth knowing here. The researchers found this pattern held clearly among men, among people who did not already have diabetes, and among people with a lower body weight. Outside those groups, the picture gets murkier, and the effect got weaker or disappeared. And because this was a tracking study, watching people's habits over time Rather than an experiment where researchers controlled what anyone ate, it shows a pattern, not a proven cause. People who naturally eat 3 meals a day may simply live differently in a dozen other ways. More activity, steadier sleep, different jobs. Any one of those could be doing the real work. So here's what the data actually supports. Eating regularly is associated with better odds, in some people, under some conditions. Not a guarantee that any specific number of meals fixes insulin resistance by itself. If you already eat 3 roughly steady meals a day, this study is a mild point in your favor, not a medal. If you naturally eat 1 or 2 larger meals and feel good, energetic, and your numbers are fine, one association in one population isn't a reason to rebuild your whole day around a headline. One study is a data point, not a verdict. That number gets used constantly to argue for eating more often, but it does not answer the question everyone is actually asking, which is what happens if the meal you skip is breakfast, specifically after 60. For that, there is a bigger, more direct study, and it does not say what you'd expect. The strange result almost nobody mentions. In a BMC public health study of more than 28,000 adults, researchers split people into 3 age groups: younger adults, middle-aged adults, and adults 65 and older, and looked specifically at whether skipping breakfast was linked to high blood sugar in each group. Among adults 65 and older, skipping breakfast showed no significant link to high blood sugar at all. In this large, age-specific look at the question, the largest one found on it, breakfast skipping in this group simply did not move the needle either way. Interestingly, the same data showed something different for adults under 45, where breakfast skipping was linked to a higher chance of high blood sugar. Whatever is happening here, the story clearly changes by age. Why would that be, when common sense says breakfast should matter? Here's a piece of biology that helps explain the confusion. Your body has a natural rise in blood sugar in the early morning, called the dawn phenomenon, well documented by the American Diabetes Association. Picture your liver as a warehouse that starts loading sugar onto trucks before the store even opens. Hormones like cortisol and growth hormone rise before you're even awake, and they push your liver to release stored sugar into your bloodstream, whether or not you've eaten anything yet. It affects roughly 3 in 10 people with insulin resistance, and more than half of people with diabetes. That means your morning blood sugar is already being shaped by hormones before breakfast enters the picture at all. Eating or not eating breakfast is only one variable in a system that's already in motion before your feet hit the floor. That is very likely part of why a single yes or no question, "Did you eat breakfast?" doesn't cleanly predict blood sugar outcomes on its own. The body isn't waiting on your decision the way the "give it a break" idea assumes. This is also why 2 people can try the exact same skip breakfast experiment and walk away with opposite conclusions. One person's dawn phenomenon is mild, so skipping breakfast changes almost nothing for them by lunchtime. Another person's is stronger, so their numbers stay elevated whether they ate or not, and they wrongly credit or blame the missed meal either way. Neither one has discovered a rule that applies to everyone. They've discovered their own body. There's one more piece people leave out when they quote this study. In that same study, people 65 and older who skipped dinner instead of breakfast had lower odds of high blood sugar. That sounds like proof skipping works, if you stop reading there. But those same dinner skippers also ate more vegetables and had generally higher quality diets overall, according to the same data. That is very likely the real explanation, not the act of skipping itself. 2 people can skip the same meal for completely different reasons, and only one of them is actually doing something protective. If there's a practical takeaway from this result, it's this. Don't let a single missed breakfast carry more meaning than it deserves, and don't assume a video or an article about breakfast and blood sugar is talking about your age group unless it says so. What applies at 35 does not automatically apply at 65 in either direction. What surrounds your eating pattern matters more than which single meal you skip. What the fasting research actually supports. There is real research on structured fasting in people over 60, tested on purpose, with people supervised through it. A 2026 review in the journal Nutrients pulled together controlled trials of specific fasting approaches in adults 60 and older. Things like eating only within an 8 to 10 hour window each day, or following a fixed fasting schedule 2 days a week. That review found these structured approaches were generally manageable and safe over the short term, with modest benefits for things like blood pressure and cholesterol, which clears structured fasting of any blanket unsafe label. But notice what that research actually studied. It studied planned structured eating windows, chosen in advance, tracked by researchers, over defined periods, often with a dietitian checking in. That is a different thing from deciding at 7 in the morning, on your own, whether coffee is enough today, then reversing that decision on Thursday because you're hungry. One is a designed protocol with a clear start and end point. The other is a coin flip dressed up as a health strategy, repeated at random for months. This is the part where most videos tell you to pick a side. Team fast or team never skip. You don't have to. The meal frequency study leans toward regular eating in a narrower group than the headline suggests. The breakfast-specific study, the largest one on this exact question, found no clear effect either way in people 65 and older. The fasting review says structured, supervised approaches can be safe and modestly helpful. None of those 3 studies agree on whether skipping breakfast is good or bad, because none of them were actually answering that exact question the same way, on the same population, with the same method. What they do agree on, without exception, is this. What's in the meal and how consistent your overall pattern is mattered more than the simple yes or no of whether breakfast happened. The clock was never the real problem. What's on the plate is. So here is the practical version, the one that skips the internet argument and the phone-tracked fasting window entirely. Whichever meal is genuinely your first one of the day, 7 a.m. or noon, give it something to anchor it. That means a source of protein or fiber alongside whatever else is on the plate. Not just coffee, and not just toast alone. An egg, a spoonful of peanut butter, a handful of nuts, plain yogurt, oats with something added to them, rather than oats by themselves. And if those particular foods aren't what's available or affordable where you are, the principle travels. A boiled egg, a scoop of beans or lentils, a small piece of leftover fish or chicken, or even a spoonful of peanuts, all work the same way. You're not shopping for a specific brand name food. You're looking for anything with protein or fiber to sit next to whatever carbohydrate is already on the plate. Call it the first bite rule. Whatever you eat first in the day, make sure it isn't just fast digesting carbohydrate arriving into a body that's already fighting the natural morning rise in blood sugar we talked about earlier. If you're not hungry until noon, that's fine. Noon becomes your first meal, and the exact same rule applies to it. Protein or fiber, not just a plain roll or a piece of fruit alone. If you do eat breakfast, you don't need to eat more than you want to feel like you did it right. A smaller anchored breakfast beats a large, unanchored one every time. And if you already skip it most days and feel fine on your usual foods and your usual numbers, this research does not hand you a reason to force a change either. One safety note, and this one is not optional. If you take insulin, or a medication like a sulfonylurea, skipping meals can risk your blood sugar dropping too low, not just running high, and that risk is not something to test out on a random Tuesday to see what happens. Do not change your eating pattern, especially around breakfast, without talking to your doctor or diabetes care team first. This video is general education, not a personal medical plan, and your medication schedule has to come from someone who actually knows your numbers, your labs, and your history. For everyone else, here is your one step. Tomorrow, whenever your first real meal actually happens, put a source of protein or fiber on the plate before anything else, even if that plate shows up at noon instead of 7. Then tell us in the comments, Do you usually skip breakfast or eat it out of habit? And has anything in this video changed how you'll decide tomorrow morning? We look through what you share here every week. If you want this turned into an actual plan instead of a rule to remember, look for the free action guide linked below this video. It walks through exactly how to anchor whichever meal comes first for you, with real, affordable options for busy or slow mornings alike. Next, we'll look at what time you eat dinner and whether that choice is quietly doing more to your morning blood sugar than breakfast ever did.